So it's 2021. You know what that means? We've had 10 years of Fine Gael in government. First under Enda Kenny, then under Leo Varadkar. And now they're in partnership with the Greens and Fianna Fáil. And what have we seen in those 10 years? Increase in precarious work, massive increase in homelessness, corruption scandal after corruption scandal, our national broadband handed over to the likes of Dennis O'Brien. But how the hell did these posh boys, who in no way represent the people of this country, not the majority anyway, how did they keep getting back in? On the 9th of March 2011, Enda Kenny was elected as the Taoiseach of Ireland. You see, people were sick of Fianna Fáil because Fianna Fáil had just bailed out the banks. And they'd done the first round of kicking the Irish people by implementing massive austerity so they could stick 64 billion in the banks. So while upper class and white collar voters moved over to Fine Gael as an alternative, the working class moved over to Labour. But a vote for the Labour Party was just a vote by default for Fine Gael because Labour were willing to prop them up. Fine Gael promised us a political revolution. Nice words, but what did it really mean? They said they'd negotiate a better deal with the bondholders and with the EU banks. They did no such thing. They continued to pay them off. NAMA trundled along with vulture funds like Cerberus, gobbling up loads of property across this country, both north and south. They introduced the household charge, the property tax, and the hated water charges. And the Labour Party just ran around behind them like their lapdogs, doing whatever they wanted. Joan Burton went after the so-called low-hanging fruit. In other words, she kicked lone parents, some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people in this country. And the so-called Labour Party went after them. It's with regard to the housing crisis that you really see what Fine Gael are about in government. There were 3,808 people homeless when they took office. Now there's 8,484, an increase of almost 5,000 people. And before COVID hit and they put people into emergency accommodations, there was over 10,000 people homeless. So well done, lads. 10 years in government and you increase the homeless figures by thousands of people. But not only that, the number of homeless children was 457 when they took office. It's now 2,452. A rise of 2,000 children living in homelessness, with the effect on their development and mental health that that's going to bring. Well done, Fine Gael. You're destroying the lives of those children. And imagine the heartbreak of the parents of those children, knowing that despite their best efforts, them and their children have to live in homelessness, and they have to watch their children growing up in homelessness. Hundreds more families have been pushed into homelessness by high rents, by mortgage arrears, and by the lack of public housing. You see, the housing crisis is no accident. The fact that big vulture funds like Canadian vulture Iris Ria can announce record profits on the one hand, and on the other hand you've record numbers of homeless families. Do you think that's a coincidence? It's no coincidence at all. Fine Gael's policies are to deprive this nation of public housing so that we become a captive market for the vulture fund landlords. The housing crisis is a direct result of their policies, not some accident. And that's exactly why it's got worse over the last 10 years. And the housing crisis isn't just the people on the front line of it who are homeless. The housing crisis is everybody that's pulling their hair out because of stress, because of rent. The housing crisis is every family that's deep into mortgage arrears and worried about the coming wave of evictions. But how did they do it? I mean, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are like used car salesmen. Every election they come on and they go, buy this piece of shit car. And some people buy it, even though it's always the same old car with a new lick of paint. Well, you see, in 2011, most working class people went from voting for Fianna Fáil to voting for Labour. So there was a huge shift left and a desire for change. But unfortunately, the Labour Party are cowards who will never stand up for the working class. James Connolly would be ashamed of the Labour Party. And so those votes for change were just wasted. Then there was a period of demoralisation where Fine Gael and Labour were in government, and Labour were able to use their control of big unions like SIP2 to dampen down any opposition to the government. Until they tried to implement the household charge and the property tax, and small networks of working class people started to fight back, which kind of laid the foundations for the water movement to come. In 2014, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across Ireland in some of the biggest protests we've seen since the tax marches back in the 70s. And the water movement shook the political establishment. Enda Kenny went from talking about water bills that would be a couple of €100 to then saying, okay, we'll only charge people for excessive use. We pushed them back, and we pushed them back with people power. Votes for the establishment parties fell. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael combined were able to cobble a deal. But they also did something very clever. They realised that working class people are more progressive than the upper class in this country. The upper class in this country have always used the Catholic Church to control us. But they knew that that wouldn't work anymore. So they embraced marriage equality and repeal to try and give themselves some progressive credentials. Although they tried to make themselves appear that they were embracing progress, they still continued to fight tooth and nail to build this tax haven economy, a corrupt gangster's paradise where vulture funds make billions while working class people suffer homelessness, poverty and precarious work. But their embrace of repeal showed their weakness, not their strength. And then in the 2020 election, working class people, having realised that the Labour Party had betrayed them, moved over to the radical left and to Sinn Féin. And there was a massive vote for change. Fine Gael were only able to cobble together a government by going into power with Fianna Fáil and the Greens. We'd driven the two right-wing parties together. They had to unite and put aside their fake fight so that they could cling to power. So now we have a government consisting of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens. A government that's going to continue doing what they've done for the last 10 years. Fine Gael are snobs. They're class warriors for the rich. And the only way to challenge them is through people power. Through big movements on the streets that would empower class warriors of the working class.